Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RadioWHO podcast on WhoWhatWhy.com. I am your host, Guillermo Jimenez. Thank you all for joining me on this, our second episode of this podcast series. Hope you guys enjoyed our discussion with Douglas Lucas last month, and in case you missed it, you can go back and check out the archives here. Of course, if you want to check out everything that I'm up to, you can find links to everything that I do and produce these days over on tracesofreality.com. You'll find links to all the social media pages, of course, all that good stuff. So I'd encourage you guys to follow me there as well. That's /Traces of Reality on Twitter and Facebook. All right, now on today's program here on RadioWHO, our guest today is Paul Allen Smith. He's the owner of the talent representation company Equitable Stewardship for Artists. He's worked in Hollywood for over 20 years and takes a very interesting perspective on the industry that he's going to share with us today. Paul, thanks so much for doing this, man. How you doing?
Guillermo, you're nice to invite me. I really appreciate it.
Sure, of course. It's great to talk to you. You know, to get us started here, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and how you got started in the industry and what it is that you do?
Well, in a nutshell, what agents do, well, most of you probably know what agents do. You watch TV, you see us, although I don't smoke a cigar. And I'm also not bald. That aside, we get talent, actors, directors, writers, jobs in the motion picture television industry. And so once we identify a gig for the client, we then would negotiate that deal. And basically, that's in a nutshell. There's a lot more that goes to it. But
right. So how much is it like Entourage? How much do you resemble Ari Gold?
You know, it's funny. I know the agent that it was modeled after.
Is that right?
Who's become very, very well. It's Rahm Emanuel's brother, Ari. And,
okay.
And Ari is beyond a superlative agent. I mean, not since Mike Ovitz has there been an agent of such. Well, how can I say this? Acumen. He is very, very good. But of course, that is a slightly exaggerated rendition of Ari.
Gotcha. Right, of course. Always dramatized a little bit, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your company here, ESA, Equitable Stewardship for Artists. I had a chance to talk to you a little bit before this recording, and you mentioned to me how this got started. But maybe you can sort of also give us a brief little rundown of. I know it's a long story, but if you could maybe summarize this a bit as far as the motivation for leaving, because you were doing awfully well with the company that you were with, and this just started. I believe just a few years ago. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So let us know when this move was made and why exactly.
Well, I love how polite you are. It can be less verbose than the other. Okay, I'm going to do my best.
Okay.
Look, the fact of the matter is what attracted me to the motion picture television industry was its role or its perceived role in our culture. So much as many of your viewers would or listeners would identify with the fourth estate as it relates to journalism, I applied the same philosophy into the motion picture television industry. And I will say to any of your listeners who are going, is he insane? You would be absolutely correct. I was insane to think that. But there you go. I was young. And to respectfully correct you, yes, 20 years is a polite way of saying it. This is actually my 30th year in the business. So I've become a fossil overnight. The reason that it's important to keep in mind what brought me to the business was I think that, frankly, we all have a role to play as it relates to our democracy and as it relates to our community and Mother Nature. Again, most of your listeners probably can identify with this. So for years and years, I was an activist in the business as it relates to probably the people that are also listening. By an activist, I mean I was very close to certain people like Howard Zinn, and Belafonte, and would go out of my way to have events where I would bring these people to speak before the Hollywood community with the hope that those in our community would realize there's more than just the business at hand, and would perhaps subtly say, oh, wow, when they're reading the script, perhaps they bring a little more sensitivity to the parts as they're written, and perhaps the messages that were being put across. And so that was my activism within the business. But after time went by and our world became clearer in my brain, I wanted to amp it up. And I realized that there was more needed from business as you and I currently define it. And I'm probably going to let you ask some more specific questions, but the long and short of it came that if you really want to make changes in America and in, well, on our planet, I stopped believing in the making any headway through legislation and discussion, if you will. I felt that new models had to be built. And instead of talking about those models, instead of donating money towards those kind of ideas, I thought, I'm going to give up this gig for which, it put me right way into the 1%. And if I took what money I had, which was not huge, but it was enough, and I used it in a more judicious manner. So I believe that by building this company, it exemplifies the values that maybe you have, and I certainly have, within what we would call a capitalist entity. I'd rather not call it a capitalist entity by virtue of the fact that I don't want to get too caught up in the nomenclature of capitalism in this conversation, although I will follow your lead.
No, sure. I know exactly what you mean by that. It's a very loaded word, and it'll take us down probably a very, very long tangent. But I don't mind going down it if you'd like. But I am curious, though, before we get into more of the particulars as far as the philosophy behind not just your company, but the philosophy that you employ, or that you say you attempted to sort of inject in Hollywood before starting this company and finding it very, very difficult to do so, and then deciding to go ahead and start your own company and do just that. Before we get into all those particulars, you mentioned your relationship with Howard Zinn, so I wanted to just have you elaborate on that a little bit before we move on from that, because you mentioned in your bio that you were in a sense, his Hollywood agent. So could you explain to the audience how that relationship began and how it developed and what that was like, actually?
Well, like many of us, I was a fan of Howard's, for years and years. What happened, the irony that this is going to take us all to Rupert Murdoch, in the late 20th century, God, how old does that make me feel? Now, in the last century, a friend of mine named Marcy Poole was hired by Peter Chernin, who was the number 2 guy at Fox, to come up with roots for the new generation. Like, what can we do to make the new Roots? And if, for those of your listeners don't remember, Roots mid-70s, and it rocked the country. And so Marcy and I were at dinner with her family, and she asked me if I had any ideas. And I said, have you ever read The People's History of the United States? And she said, yeah, in college. I said, well, I think that could be a new kind of Roots. And she was excited. And then I knew that I could get to Howard Zinn through David Barsamian, who runs alternative radio, who's just as solid a cat as they get. You probably know him. Mm-hmm. And he hooked me up with Howard. I flew out there, and what happened concurrently, Marcy went after Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, who I thought would perhaps be interested in this project as they plugged the book in Good Will Hunting.
Right.
Little did I know until I got to Boston to sit down with Howard that Howard was, like, he's not officially Matt's godfather, but he grew up next door to Matt and taught with Matt's mom. I hope I'm getting that right. Mm-hmm. And knew these guys And so I had no idea. So Marcy, to her credit, secured them through Chris Moore, their producer, and they came on board. And then Howard would refer to me as his Hollywood agent. And if you know Howard, he was wicked funny. And we spent 90% of our conversations laughing like crazy. And he was unbelievably funny. So that exhausted itself. That eventually went from Fox, and then it was moved to HBO, and then it kind of fizzled away. And Howard and I maintained a very close friendship up until the very end. And then that documentary they all did, that was with Anthony Arnaud. That was not done with my involvement at all. Like I said, but Howard did have a great deal of influence on me in certain respects.
Gotcha. And so actually this reminds me of something else that I wanted to talk to you about as far as, well, it all sort of connects as far as the idea of humanitarianism in Hollywood, for lack of a better term, and how difficult it is, or perhaps not, to produce projects like the one you just described. And actually, well, I do want to hear about that for sure. There's also the larger issue that I wanted to talk to you about. So I'll just go ahead and throw it out there, and you can answer it sort of within that context. Because as we talked about before, talking to you previously, and even anyone who reads your bio will learn quickly that you're a very thoughtful person, a very thoughtful guy. And given that you do care so deeply about many of these larger issues that do affect everyone in this country and throughout the world, really. But you happen to work, in show business. So I wanted to get your take on a few things as they relate to culture, media, and society. And so I suppose we'll start broad and then work our way down to the finer details. But so, the old saying goes, art imitates life. But I'd like to know what you think about Hollywood's role in American culture. Is it a reflection of our culture? Does it play a role in engineering the culture, in steering it in one direction or the other, and if so, to what degree? So your thoughts on that, but also, again, if you could describe, in that context, if it is difficult to produce the work that you just described.
Okay, well, there's a lot there. I think I'm going to touch upon, I'm going to approach this first from a direction that may make sense to
sure.
viewers. And we briefly touched on this.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important when people talk about Hollywood is not to have any misconceptions of it. I think you have to approach and look at Hollywood much as you would look at the auto industry or the pharmaceutical industry. They're there to not just make money, but make money for shareholders. That is really what you have to start from that mindset. Otherwise, you will go berserk.
Mm-hmm.
And you really will. I mean, that's, again, I made reference to the Fourth Estate. And when Ben Bakdigian would talk about the media monopoly, he was talking about journalism as it played a role in our democracy, rightfully so. What journalism became is what Hollywood has always been.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take the same concerns that Bakdigian presented to us how many years ago? I mean, God, I'm afraid to ask now, but 25, 30? It shouldn't surprise anybody that Hollywood in general leaves them feeling relatively empty. But it's relative to those of whom are engaged in the world or in their communities in a deeper level. By deeper, they are moved to understand it in a systemic fashion. So if they have a relationship in and around them to that level of nuance, they will forever be disappointed with what Hollywood puts out, because Hollywood's never going to go that deep. They're going to always wait for their, one we would call it the body politic, to allow it to be a palatable concept, and then they'll start toying with it. So one of the greater examples and the most prevalent is gay rights or just gay people. It's been extraordinary what Hollywood has done, in my mind, in the last 10 years. Glee in particular blows my mind in this concept in terms of what the significance of the imagery. Seeing two boys in high school kiss, I mean, that's unfathomable for me to imagine seeing when I was a kid. And so my hat is off to them. And again, paradoxically, Rupert Murdoch for letting on. I mean, that's again another tangent to go on.
Sure.
But Glee made oodles and oodles and oodles, and take all those oodles and cube it, and that's how much money it made for Rupert Murdoch. So there's that equation again. But where I'm going is there were and many gay people before the last 10, 15 years fighting for those rights. So when you look at it in this context and you say, oh, isn't Hollywood cutting edge? And you can see Will and Grace and that. Well, the truth is, sadly, there are many gay people working in Hollywood in very, very prominent positions who are in the closet. So it's a matter of how you want to analyze Hollywood. And, you, me, perhaps your viewers, that it is easy to pick on Hollywood, but I find that Hollywood is picked on in a way that avoids the true issue at hand. And the true issue at hand is related to what I was talking about, the responsibility in this case, a large corporation has to its shareholders.
Right. In terms of economics, I see. No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think I know exactly what you're saying here. That we have to look at Hollywood like any other industry and examine it first from that sort of premise. But I mean, even still, I would respectfully disagree just a little bit. And I want to get your insight because you're the one in the industry. But when it comes to an industry like the audio industry, for example, Toyota's trying to sell me a truck after all. But with Hollywood, you're selling stories, you're selling narratives, you're selling ideas. And so I think that's a very, very powerful thing, as you mentioned, within the larger context of media in general. And even though I know, obviously, that Hollywood, its purpose is to entertain, it's not there to inform like news media would be. However, it often probably has a much larger effect on the body politic and the population than any other media outlet. So I'm wondering, if that's true, if Hollywood does have a bigger effect, let's say, in that sense, then do the owners, do producers have any sort of moral responsibility to promote those positive values as you've decided to do?
Okay. First of all, you don't have to be that respectful to me. But thank you. Next, when you say that Hollywood is there to sell stories, I'm going to be respectful to you. I would respectfully disagree. I don't think Hollywood is there to sell stories. I think Hollywood the broadcast and basic cable is there to sell you products.
Very true.
And furthermore, premium cable is there to sell you the packages so you sign up for HBO or Netflix or Showtime. That's their objective. So I think that's very, very important for you to keep in mind. And as far as the cars go, here's my trip with that and how it relates to our company. They're selling your car, but what I'm concerned about is they're not trying to sell you a car with maximum gas mileage. They gave away the hybrid industry to the Japanese. They crushed the electric car industry. I mean, we all saw that documentary, 10, 15 years ago. There is no moral responsibility in the auto industry any more than there should be in Hollywood because they're looking to maximize profits. And in this context, I find that the manner by which I scrutinize the auto industry, and Ralph Nader would certainly scrutinize the auto industry, it's on this level by which I'm speaking of Hollywood as large institutions. Now, if we broke it down individually, if anybody came to me and said, well, Paul, what do you think of the average individual participant in Hollywood as it relates to certain concerns for the public and the like? I've never worked in Detroit, but I would tell you that individually, the average Hollywood person is is very smart and relatively very sensitive to issues that concern us all. But I am nevertheless critical of the institutions for which we are subservient. But I think this is a behavior that needs to be discussed, because we all are susceptible to, to listening or paying attention to those of whom pay us or dictate our future. But this is, we can call it self-censorship. But this is what I'm referring to, and I hope I'm not going off too much on a tangent, but I'm trying so that you and I are speaking on the same wavelength.
Sure.
But if I'm off on tangent, just say, Paul.
No, it's making sense, and I think you have a very good point as far as the true reason why there is a film and television industry. Of course, I think you're absolutely right. It is to sell products. That's after all why you have that TV is the sort of the products are packaged around or within the programs that the studios put out. But even still, again, I have to go back because let me tell you where I'm coming from at this from. So the way I'm thinking of it, and you sort of you touched on it a little bit in the opening of the conversation when you mentioned how Roots was so influential, and so that's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of it in terms of the way art forms like film and television influence the culture in one direction or the other. I think it does influence, for example, affect our language, not just the words that we use, but the way we talk or engage about an issue. It can often lead one way, can often lead another. It does have the effect, in a sense, I mean, not to be crude, but in a way to propagandize the public, inciting one way or the other. Not necessarily in sort of nefarious way or anything, but I think it definitely has the potential to be used for nefarious purposes, for sure. But it can be used also as a promoter of social change and awareness, even though that's not what it's meant to do, but it can have that byproduct, I suppose. And so, but I think you're right. There is no monetary incentive or any incentive for the big mega studios to do that, but there may be an incentive to do the opposite and reinforce principles of the status quo, reinforce the establishment. So, I mean, what do you make of that? Is there any sort of tendency you think generally for the industry to lean in a sort of authoritarian, pro-establishment sort of way to reinforce a certain cultural mores, let's say?
Well, I don't know about authoritarian, but I would say nationalistic.
Okay.
And I think we see this particularly in what we have genres, and if you would call it a police procedural, for which we have many on air, as you know. Those are we have a lot of military, a lot of FBI, a lot of CIA. We get a lot of that.
Yeah.
And part of it because it's exciting and it's, you tell these stories and all that jazz. I mean, they're easier to tell. I mean, that's a whole another conversation of why they pick these genres. But if you're asking, does it lean there? Well, 100% it does. That the symbiosis between the Washington establishment and the Hollywood establishment is well documented. And, I assume your listeners are only too aware of, if you're going to do something on the military and you want to use their bases, and therefore, what our tax dollars at work is living they're going to approve it, and they have to pre-approve it. So, again, I go back to the concept of self-censorship. Does this exist a great deal? Sure. And again, if you follow the owners of the studios, networks, the advertisers, you'll find that they come from a particular kind of class, and not necessarily socioeconomic, but a certain kind of mindset, where, look, the country has worked very well for them, and the system works very well for them. So you're not going to be overly keen on criticizing it. But I, again, think it's all relative. And so I do also want to touch on, you said, well, Paul, they did have roots. Yes, they did in the 70s. And, to Peter Churton and Marcy Poole's credit, they did try to, try and recreate something of that significance. And to Matt Damon and Ben Affleck's credit, they also lent their talent towards the development of it. But it's not easy to do. You had the Walper family do Roots at a time when America was all collectively accessible to broadcast, and it did have a great impact. And you and I probably agree. Our industry can have a tremendous impact on America. And the world. We both know it. It is what attracted me to it. I studied theater. Why would I not want to take the artistry of theater, reflecting upon the true fabric of the country, and apply it to the most powerful potential art form known, and that's the television series. Why would I not want to do that? Well, Norman Lear was making some real progress with that. And even journalism at that time was making some progress. But there was a backlash, and we're seeing the backlash to this day. And I would argue it's an institutionalized backlash. Mm-hmm. And so I'm with you. Television absolutely does, or movies too. But television is more important because of the repetitiveness. It can compete with the concept of propaganda that you can repeat. If you had a really radical or interesting character, like of Archie Bunker, or a meathead, you see them evolve and move with time. A movie is in and out, right? And that's why television is so potent, and it's such an amazing potential art form. And I'm with you, and I would love to believe that it is possible down the road for us to see characters that reflect upon the world that in such a way that you then feel like you're meeting people who normally don't have a voice, be it the grandfather who experienced Iran during Mossadegh and then the capturing of our hostages, and who can then bring a level of nuance to that history in a way that isn't anti-America, but it's also not anti-Iran. And the same thing we can apply to the Middle East as it applies to many of the people there who suffer all over the region now, to make them more human to the average American, because we live in a country that doesn't seem to be dedicated to bringing nuance to any one subject.
Right.
And television can do that. But I would argue it's very, very difficult to do, even with the backing financially of a network or a studio. It's really, really hard to do. But I would argue,
seems like but it seems like not only a difficult thing to do to portray or to humanize an issue or a people, let's say. I think it often does exactly the opposite, as you say. Since it is difficult, maybe that's partially the reason why. But it often serves to dehumanize and to, for example, I'm thinking of shows like you mentioned them. There's plenty of them that we could go through a list of television programs that do portray, for example, the war on terror as a noble cause, and the enemy as a sort of nebulous, amorphous, brown, bad guy, right? And there's 24 really took this to another level as far as the way it normalized torture to the American public. But maybe I'm making too much of it. Maybe you give me a different perspective. Maybe that was a reflection of what the country was sensing at the time, and it wasn't necessarily the shaper of opinion rather than just a reflection of public opinion. But I think that's one of the ones that really sticks out to me anyway.
Well, I think, if you go back to my theory, I think the country did feel that way. Now, could you argue that show, for which I didn't watch regularly, did it exacerbate it? Yeah, you can make that argument. And conversely, you can say, well, Paul, why isn't there programming to counter the status quo? And I believe that for the same reason if you were to go into Washington and said, what is, they don't seem to be working on behalf of the average individual.
Right. Why don't they represent me?
Right. And so if you apply that same mindset to Hollywood, I think that you're going to consistently be angry at Hollywood. And that's not what Hollywood is about, nor should they apologize for what they are about, based on the way our economics work in this country. And by economics, the manifestation of American capitalism has never encouraged the application of any kind of morality, or what I guess a Buddhist would say, cause and effect. It's not inherent to the objective of making money, and yet I believe it should be. But that's me, and that's the reason that we built this company. Is what would a company look like that is superlative at the gig at hand? In this case, as we talked about my job is agenting, but I built this company so that it could be emulated. God, how arrogant is it? but at least it could be like, okay, this guy got most of it wrong, but he did get some of it right. Look at this, he's not completely insane. And that was the design of this company, because we have to redefine our economic constructs. Notice I'm afraid to define it as, for your listeners, as capitalism, but I don't have a problem 100% with capitalism. I do have a great deal of problem with how capitalism has been manipulated in our country to supersede the health of our democracy and Mother Nature. But if we get too caught up in the concept of what is capitalism, what isn't, it's a waste of energy. Instead, let's build models that absolutely emulate our priorities, such that we'll find words for them. That language will always be around to call it whatever we end up calling it, because I don't want to get caught into a socialist entity either, although there's socialist concepts that I talk about by virtue of the fact that when we discuss capitalism, much of the problem in my mind, besides the lack of morality integrated into the equation of making money, is how profit is dispersed amongst the workers and the other employers, the other employers in that company. That's what I'm finding very fascinating, at least from this point of view, now that I'm an owner.
Right. Very interesting. And I want to come back to the economics here for sure, and I want to close on that. But before we do, I had one last thing I wanted to ask you about as far as Hollywood as a sort of mover and shaker of culture that I wanted to get your take on. Something that I noticed recently that perhaps you picked up on, and I want to get your insight into it. And so one of the I guess most recent examples that I can think of as far as a film having a very visible effect on our culture is V for Vendetta, and you might already know where I'm going with this now. So that the imagery, right, of the Guy Fawkes mask, and how it became a symbol for Anonymous and a symbol for Occupy, and can now be seen at every major protest all over the world. And now recently I also saw a story, interestingly, this is maybe a month or so old now, I saw a news story coming out of Thailand of people who were protesting the military dictatorship there in the streets doing the Hunger Games symbol with the three fingers. So I thought that was rather interesting. So we have these young adult dystopian novels becoming huge Hollywood blockbuster films, not just the Hunger Games, but there's The Giver, there's Divergent, there's loads more, I'm sure. And so interestingly, these films have what I would call a very strong anti-authoritarian message, right? They have they express ideas about the dangers of out-of-control government and technocracy and the loss of liberty and the police state and encroaching tyranny and these sorts of ideas that if you were to say or express these ideas in another form of big media, you'd be called a loony, right? You'd be called a conspiracy theorist, or there's no place for that kind of talk unless it's presented in a sort of nonfiction narrative. Then the public loves it, and they'll buy the T-shirt. They'll buy 2 of them. So, I mean, I guess there's probably something to be said about the way this thing functions on a sociological level, on a psychological level. But I'm wondering if you've picked up on this and what you make of this phenomenon.
Well, first of all, I think this disenfranchisement is quite prevalent all over the world. I think you brought up Occupy. I think there was a reason that they forcefully and brutally brought it to an end. They knew that there were embers, and there are here and there elsewhere. And the game is for any government to maintain control. And so with that in mind, yes, I do think it's out there. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, or at least I'm not. I'm now well into middle age, okay? So I'm hip to their concerns. Globally, I've been around the world, and I'm very, very lucky in this concept, so I see the similarities we all have. What are we going to do? So what will it look like? And I'm sorry, I in the back of my mind, I'm not really indulging the question because, yeah, it is there. Mm-hmm. I get it. So what are people like us going to do? How do we, and I learned this, we haven't mentioned, I'm going to drop the name Harry Belafonte because Harry was the one who influenced me when I was just an assistant on a desk in the mid-'80s to do kind of what I'm doing. I don't want to discount my own family, but Harry really played a role in this. And the truth is, what Harry and his generation did is they went out and they tried to make change and changing the laws and creating new alternatives. What I keep bringing back to the conversation here is, yes, there are these messages in these films and there is a real appetite, but what are we going to do to harness that energy? And as a quasi-elder, it is incumbent upon us to guide that energy in a way that just isn't solely a revolution. Because part of the problem is when you go out and you do the big march that everyone did last weekend, mm-hmm. if you don't sustain that, if you don't create concurrently alternatives such that our people, you, me, your listeners, do something collectively and consistently, something that shows our numbers, that is peaceful, but it is also constructive. If we, particularly the elders, don't create these alternatives now that address the very issues that they are coming, falling into, that they're like, so despondent and, doing the hand gestures that you alluded to, mm-hmm. we're the ones who are failing. We're the ones who have to be the real leaders, because leadership doesn't exist anymore in Washington, nor does it in Wall Street. That is eroded in our country. So if Americans truly want to be exceptional, and I believe we can be, I actually think Americans, and I'm talking about the body politic, are yearning to do something together, collectively and consistently, to actually live up to this rhetoric of exceptionalism. But that means we have to, in fact, be exceptional. And that means we need to sacrifice something, all of us. And so it is incumbent upon us to create new models. The company that I wanted to talk to you about, in essence, is my attempt to not only build it, but to sacrifice my own socioeconomic class to build something. And we all need to start supporting each other. And so we have to be our own leader. And that's difficult for people. It's really easy to say that the world is over and throw in the towel. But that is not the case. Americans still have the ability to do things together and to feed off each other, particularly those of whom share our sense of future, or ideology, if you will. But we must support each other. And that's not as hard as people think. It is a discipline. I'm sorry I went off on this tangent.
No, it's quite all right. In fact, I just wanted to echo quickly something you said. I do agree that absolutely, I think there is a yearning for what you just described I think Occupy really did show that, at least for a time, even if it may have been a brief period of time. And I know that there are still a lot of people working within that movement, let's say, to express those ideas. It's just not as pronounced as it was a few years ago. And so that's also begs the question as to why that is, why it was not sustained, why it could not remain consistent, as you said. There's a lot of factors play into that, I'm sure. But I think it's partly to do with the level of comfort that most Americans enjoy, and it goes back to the economics of it all. It goes back to the consumerism of it all. But on the notion of economics, though, and on the notion of media, because I think you actually, in a way, answered my question already, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Because I think, you mentioned the fact that, obviously economics plays a huge role in this, but I wanted to go back to the idea of the way media in general, not just Hollywood, because we've established Hollywood as a money-making entity. But speaking of the media broadly, and maybe even journalism specifically, it's supposed to have a more lofty goals than that, right? It's supposed to be more than just making money, and yet journalism or news media, let's say, put it more broad, has become itself, as you mentioned early in this conversation, a money-making entity. The same media companies, for that matter, that produce films in Hollywood now are taking over or buying up many of the major news companies. In fact, this is not a shocker to anyone listening right now, but we all know that there's literally 5 or 6 companies that produce everything we see in media, from music to the evening news. And so from that perspective, from the sort of business end of things and from the consumer end of things, I wanted to get your take on what can be done to counter that, or how you see that.
Well, you have to somehow reprioritize what America is about. And again, I'm gonna sound like a politician. I keep saying this. You're right. Let's take journalism. People like us have a relationship to journalism because if we were to draw an analogy to being in shape and being fit, we can handle the nuances of what journalists tell us. So if it's a journalist in Palestine or a journalist in Tel Aviv, if we have any historical context, we can appreciate both perspectives and apply them into our own mindset. If you believe in democracy, if you truly believe in democracy and the requisites of maintaining, and let's go back to the body politic, we'll talk about it as a body. If the body is healthy, then you feed it, this is journalism, all kinds of information, nutrients, and you trust that they can debate it and deal with it. You give them that level of respect. That's how you celebrate, in my mind, American patriotism. So if you look at it in this context and you say, what happened to journalism? What happened to journalism? The question is, what happened to democracy? What happened to teaching what makes a democracy? Because to be a healthy democracy is the same as being in great shape. It isn't enough just to read a magazine on how to stay fit. You must manifest what it says. Therefore, democracy requires proactiveness on all of us individually. If that is discouraged and instead replaced by the economics, and in this case, the economics is go out and manifest, spending money or getting things and all that jazz. If you look at how it is presented comparatively, the desire for the Americans to participate economically, which is not bad, but it is disproportionate to how we are encouraged to participate in democratic sense. This is what is off. If you went to a doctor, they would just say, look, man, you're imbalanced. So we're not saying get rid of capitalism in this context, but we are saying let's take some of that energy and apply it to actually real debates, third party candidates, and the like. We all know what it would look like, but if it's not encouraged, in the culture, and this does bring it back to Hollywood, and I think this is where Hollywood could play a better part. If it's not encouraged in our culture, you say, well, why isn't it encouraged in the culture? What has happened? Well, you go back to Judge Brandeis and you look at what he predicted if corporations and the like got too much power. And if there is that imbalance, and we all are familiar with it, what does it look like? Well, this is what it looks like. I mean, if you look at the 96 Telecommunications Act, not in and of itself the most egregious legislation ever, but if you throw that in, with the other deregulation that came, both from, as your listeners know, from Democrats and Republicans, all in exchange for the monies they get to run for elections. If you look at the systemic issues, it's really simple. We're not interested in living up to our capability of being exceptionally democratic, if you will. So, okay, let's fix it. How? Well, you and I both know we designed PBS for just that. It became politicized. So how do you shift that? How do you shift the body politic again into yearning for it? Well, the truth is, you start giving it to them. Somehow we have to find a way to redistribute nuanced information. I have to tell you, I think we can do it. But the first step is, I believe, conversations like this, where you're not pointing fingers at red state, blue state. You're not giving up to being divided. You're saying, listen, I'm open to hearing what you're going to say. As long as you're open to hearing what I'm going to say. And why? Because that's America. It's all you're saying, God, this guy's like, who the hell is he? He's like talking about patriotism. We, people like you and me, have to redefine what patriotism is and what shows like you're about and your colleague Russ is about. Investigative journalism is patriotism. Investigative journalism is democracy in action. This is what it looks like. Was it Rumsfeld who said it's messy?
I think so,
yeah,
right.
It's a drag, man. It's a drag having to hear another person's point of view, particularly another person's point of view who you really like, and it's different from the narrative by which you were brought up. That's difficult. What do you call that muscle? Well, a lot of us go to couples counseling to maintain to get hip to that muscle. Like, how do you do it? And that's what needs to be encouraged in America. And that's what, if you want to call our side, our ideological side, this is what we have to do to grow. We have to be there to prop each other up and be vigilant with it. But we also have to keep reminding people, this is real patriotism.
I have to agree. That's a great answer, man. That's a great answer. And in fact, I really enjoy that analogy, by the way, of, it's not enough to just sit there and read the magazine about being fit. You have to actually go out there and exercise. So it's not enough to just talk about, being independent and being having a strong democracy or whatever you want to, it's you have to live it. You have to go and do it. And I think that's a really, it's a good way it's a good motto. It's a good philosophy to live by and exemplify, as you've tried to do. Again, bringing it back to what you've done in your career and what we're trying to do here with shows like this, just going at it independently, doing your own thing outside of the norm and outside of that establishment circle, and trying to make an effect. And I think that I think you're right. I think that in itself is a positive step forward. I think we ought to leave it there. That's a really good place to leave this conversation, I feel. But before we do close out, is there anything else that you'd like to say as far as where folks out there can learn more about what it is that you do or the company that you represent? Anything else in closing before we close out the conversation officially here?
No, other than talking about our company is nothing more than what I was alluding to with, look, you all eventually have to do something. Do not feel pressure within the parameters of your life that, oh, I'm not doing enough. Again, if we go back to getting into shape and you feel out of shape, first step is just to walk. Go for a walk for 10, 15 minutes. That's it. That walk will lead to a 20-minute walk, 30-minute walk, and before you know it, you're going to stop. Maybe you'll do some push-ups. We have to all support one another as we try to do something. You yourself, you and Russ, you're doing something, and it leads to new things. And I'm nothing, but if I look at it on a molecular basis, once you start doing something that in the right direction, that leads to a healthy evolution. And we're a peculiar animal. We're going to probably be the first one who has to predetermine our own evolution, which I think is the joke that Mother Nature is playing on us now and seeing if we can live up to it. So I think what you are doing and what Russ are doing is so important, because when I read what you guys put out, it challenges me. I say to myself, Paul, these guys are doing this. How are you going to apply this energy? And I get that from you. And that's how I ended up talking to you today. So you never know who you're going to encourage, even if it's just a very, very, very small, tiny step. That's it, man. Just that is enough.
That's what it takes, absolutely. A series of tiny steps, but they're there. They're happening. I really appreciate you talking to me today, Paul. It's been a really good conversation. I really enjoyed it. I'm really glad you were able to take the time out to do this. Again, I very much appreciate that. So that was Paul Allen Smith of Equitable Stewardship for Artists, eaartist.com. This is your host, Guillermo Jimenez, inviting you to come back and join us again right here on the RadioWHO podcast. Thank you for listening.